Good morning, everybody. Welcome back, Corey Hughes Bloody History. So we're going to continue on with John Armstrong. And so, God, the last couple days, I've been really spending a lot of time going through his website. I found a sitemap. He's got, 50 decent articles on there. And, man, there is some stuff I want to get to like right now, but I feel like I need to continue to lay the foundation of his work. So let me just sum up in a nutshell my thoughts overall on Armstrong, his work, the Harvey and Lee theory, and all of that stuff. Okay, so his conclusions on the assassination are fucking dead wrong. Period. Like, he continued with this. This is the biggest problem that I have with all of Armstrong's work, is that he attributed this Harvey and Lee scenario, which was obviously real, obviously a CIA program to get a spy into the Soviet Union. Nothing too shocking there, right? People will believe the MK Ultra stuff and all the mind control and the Philadelphia experiment and the Montauk Project, but they won't believe that they raised a duplicate child. Give me a fucking break. It's so stupid. Of course they did this stuff, right? So, his work in general, I find that he did an amazing job of digging up the dots, right? Doing the interviews, asking the right questions. I mean, all the stuff that he did with Myra DeRoos and Frank Kudlady and those interviews, they're just shocking. They're shocking. And it took me a long time to come around to this notion that there was a Harvey and a Lee. Now, obviously, they used the same information for both people, right? Like when they were in the Marine Corps, they had the same serial number. But there's a lot of things for me that just are weird, right? Like how could these two kids go to the same school, go to Beauregard for a semester together? One having homeroom in room 303, the other one having homeroom in the basement with Myra DeRoos. How could that be? And like nobody ever scratched their head and said, what's going on here? How is it that the administration didn't seem to have any issues with two Lee Harvey Oswalds being enrolled there at the same goddamn time with the same information? Like, this is what I don't understand. And so Jim and I were talking about this at length yesterday, and I think we kind of came to the conclusion that Armstrong gets ahead of himself a little bit, right? He's so married to the idea in every single scenario that he couldn't see outside of that, right? So I think he kind of tries to force things that don't make sense. Whereas he doesn't really need to do that, because the vast majority of the body of his work speaks for itself. I mean, like, fuck John Armstrong. Who the hell's John Armstrong, right? The fucking work that he did, the data itself is absolutely shocking and stunning. And we have a photographic record, and we have testimony of people who were involved in incidents that nobody even knows it happened in regards to Kennedy. So, I mean, he is to be lauded. His work is amazing. It truly is. He didn't wrap his head around the assassination or the fact that post-1959, all the impersonations of Oswald in the States here, all surrounded, beginning with like Bolton Ford. Now, we're going to get into in the next couple of days other incidents that I didn't know about that happened up in New York City, Greenwich Village, with some other weird spy stuff connected to allegedly a Lee Harvey Oswald. But Armstrong has a collection of other incidents that I was unaware of that are not in Weisberg's false Oswald files. So, yeah, props to him for digging up all this data. And I'm going to do my best to kind of roll with his bad conclusions, and I'll point out his bad conclusions every time I see them. Like, for instance, the Bolton Ford incident he believes was Lee Oswald, right? While Harvey Oswald was in the Soviet Union. And we know that Oswald was still in the Soviet Union at the time, right? But when you split second that you link that to the Friends of Democratic Cuba, Guy Bannister, and all that stuff, it becomes blatantly obvious that the husky Latino with the pockmarked face who was at that incident was Lawrence Howard, because it was always Lawrence Howard. And that would mean that the other person is William Seymour. However, I'll be honest with you, and I've kind of updated my thinking since my book. I am far more open now to the possibilities that Bolton Ford was Kerry Thornley the whole time. And I say that partially because Oscar Deslat at Bolton Ford said that these guys were the same height. That would only make sense if it was... That wouldn't make sense if it was William Seymour, but it would make sense if it was Kerry Thornley, who was closer to 5'10", 5'9.5", much closer to Lawrence Howard. And the fact that he puts himself back in New Orleans a month after that happened, not even a month, like 2.5 weeks after that incident, tells me he was aware of that incident and knew to shape his date of return around it, right? So Armstrong missed things like that. He did not, I don't really see him mention, or haven't seen him mention, the husky Latino with the pockmarked face who pops up everywhere, right? The one who's seen at all these different Oswald sightings. Another thing he does is that he will put, quote unquote, while Harvey Oswald is in the Soviet Union, he'll put Lee Oswald hanging out with our people down in New Orleans and in Miami. And this is where he really fucked up. Because that's clearly not the case. That's clearly not the fucking case, all right? All the stuff that was going on in Miami, I believe, if there even, because there were multiple Oswald sightings down there, multiple incidents involving Oswald, and that person was described as being shorter, 5'6" or 5'7". That's William Seymour. To me, it's obvious it's William Seymour. Do I have the evidence? No, but if it walks like a duck and quacks like a duck, it's a duck. And all that shit going on in Miami at the same time that William Seymour is living down there in Miami. All of the sightings of Oswald at the Havana Club and where else? That was in October. So you have, when you look at all the different incidents of Oswald being seen with the husky Latino with the pockmarked face, and then you look at where William Seymour is known to have been, they all line up. Except for the fact that William Seymour was clearly in Dallas working at the book depository in lieu of Oswald. That to me, I can't unsee it, period. I've tried to play devil's advocate with myself. I can't unsee it. That's just how it was. So much evidence that it was William Seymour inside the book depository on November 22nd. And you're not going to let your patsy wander around the building while you got fucking assassins on the 6th floor setting him up. It's so dumb. Think about that. You're setting up a guy for the assassination of the president. You got assassins on the 6th floor in the roof. You got a spotter on the 1st floor watching the elevator. But yet you're going to let Lee Harvey Oswald wander around the building at his own free will and hope he doesn't go up there? Are you fucking kidding? It's so stupid. Just take 2 seconds and think about it. So, back to Armstrong. His inability to see past this Harvey and Lee, charade that was going on for so many years. He didn't realize that Oswald was ultimately being set up by people much closer to David Ferry and those guys, right? Like William Seymour, who was also an associate of Frank Sturgis, right? He was in Operation 40. There's a famous picture of Sturgis covering his face with his arm around William Seymour. I mean, that's how close they were. They were tight. So, but Armstrong never saw that. Armstrong never saw that angle of it. I haven't seen any of that in his work. And when you actually go into his book, Harvey and Lee, and you look for the names William Seymour and Kerry Thornley, you only find those names one time each. You'll find that name once each. That blew me away. Because Kerry Thornley he's the man down there in New Orleans. He is the guy. But I'm getting off track. So let's get back to this. Today what we're going to cover is The Two Marguerite Oswalds by John Armstrong. So if you're going to have two Lee Harvey Oswalds, you obviously have to have two Marguerites. As students of the assassination of President Kennedy, it is important to suspend for a moment the detail on the ground in Dealey Plaza in order to understand a period of unprecedented change in America in the post-war world of 1945 to 1963. That world was becoming an increasingly scary place. In August of 1945, the world's first atomic bombs were dropped over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The British Empire, Germany, and Japan were in a state of collapse. A new world order was being shaped with two superpowers, the Soviet Union and the United States, locked in an ideological struggle and an arms race. The new American foreign policy of containment and the domino theory were being taught to school children. A March 1946 poll showed that 60% of Americans believed that U.S. policy toward Russia was too soft. Winston Churchill delivered his Iron Curtain speech on March 6, 1946, his famous image to serve to define the world in a pair of binary opposites. A new national security network was created with virtually unlimited powers as the Central Intelligence Agency was created on July 26, 1947, when President Truman signed the National Security Act into law. In a climate of fear that extended through the McCarthy era, the prevailing view was that extraordinary circumstances call for extraordinary measures. It appeared as though the American people, were willing to accept secrecy from their government in return for keeping everyone safe. It was in this world in the late 1940s that a relatively inconsequential Cold War intelligence operation unfolded with the purpose of planting a Russian-speaking American spy in the Soviet Union. The story has nothing to do directly with the assassination of President Kennedy, but it has everything to do with understanding the true identity of Lee Harvey Oswald and Marguerite Oswald. For hundreds of years, secret agents and spies have been used to confuse, mislead, and deceive in order to acquire sensitive military information. Spies often assume the identity of a person who died as a child, died in battle, or simply disappeared. However, there are many problems when a spy assumes the identity of a dead person. The main problem has always been the inability to trace the biography of a spy back to their families, to their childhood, and to their birth record. A comprehensive background investigation of a suspected spy will uncover their true identity and will also uncover the identity of a person who they assumed. A basic requirement for infiltrating a spy into a foreign country is that he/she speak and read the local language fluently. After all, it would be pointless to send an English-speaking spy into China, Russia, the Middle East, unless they spoke and read the language. Tens of millions of people were killed in Europe during World War II, which resulted in tens of thousands of refugee children from many different countries. Thousands of these underage children who spoke only their native languages were relocated to the United States and placed with foster families. One of these children, in my opinion, was a 6, 7, or 8-year-old Russian-speaking boy who was placed with a middle-aged woman caretaker in New Jersey and or New York. This caretaker was given the name Marguerite Oswald. I call this woman the Marguerite Oswald imposter. Robert Edward Lee Oswald, was born on March 4th, 1896. As an adult, he worked for the Metropolitan Life Insurance Company in New Orleans. On November 1st, 1920, 24-year-old Robert married 28-year-old Margaret Emma Keating, date of birth April 28, 1892. 13 years later, on January 10, 1933, the couple divorced. Ms. Keating never remarried and continued living in her home at 120 North Telemachus in New Orleans for the next 30 years. And he has a photograph of Miss Keating standing with her mother in front of her home. The one physical feature of this woman that caught my attention was her downward sloping eyebrows. Edward John Pick, date of birth August 21st, 1907, and Marguerite Frances Claverie, date of birth July 19th, 1907, were married on August 1st, 1929. On January 17th, 1932, John Edward Pick was born. A year and a half later, the couple divorced. On July 15th, 1933, Mr. Pick eventually remarried and in 1964 was interviewed in New Orleans by the Warren Commission. Mr. Pick lived a long life and died at age 94 on January 22nd, 2002. 5 days after divorcing Edward John Pick, Marguerite married Robert Edward Lee Oswald, date of birth March 4th, 1896. In New Orleans on July 20th, 1933. 9 months later, on April 7th, 1934, Robert Oswald was born. On August 19th, 1939, Robert Edward Lee Oswald died from a heart attack, age 43. 2 months later, on October 18th, Lee Harvey Oswald was born in New Orleans. In the early 1940s, after 2 marriages and 3 children, Marguerite Claverie Oswald began working for the U.S. Navy in Algiers, Louisiana, across the river from New Orleans. Marguerite soon met Edwin Ekdahl, date of birth September 26, 1895, an electrical engineer who graduated from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Ekdahl was working for Ebasco Services Company in New York City. One of Ebasco's projects was the design of a large electrical generation station in the Soviet Union, which suggests the company worked closely with U.S. intelligence. In 1964, following the assassination of President Kennedy, the FBI requested information on Ibasco related to the employment of Mr. Ekdahl. The FBI was told that Ibasco was unable to provide such information. In 1945, Marguerite Claverie Oswald moved to Fort Worth and married Edwin Ekdahl. 2 years later, in the summer of 1947, while living with Ekdahl and her 3 sons at 1505 8th Avenue, Fort Worth, another, quote, Marguerite Oswald was living at 101 San Saba in Benbrook, Texas, with a young Russian-speaking boy who was given the name, quote, Harvey Oswald. What follows is a detailed biographical study of a government-sponsored caretaker, who I call the Marguerite Oswald imposter, who was given the job of taking care of young Harvey Oswald. For the next 12 years, the imposter and Harvey lived in close proximity to Marguerite Claverie Oswald and her son Lee Harvey Oswald. As these young boys lived nearby in the same cities, often attended the same schools, and later spent time in the Marine Corps, both Harvey Oswald and Lee Oswald had established very similar backgrounds. At age 18, the plan was to have Russian-speaking Harvey Oswald assume the identity of American-born Lee Harvey Oswald. Harvey would then defect to the Soviet Union, where his native-speaking Russian ability would be invaluable. The Russian KGB, if concerned or curious about this American defector, would then be able to track Lee Harvey Oswald's background back to his birth. The mother of Lee Oswald and the caretaker/imposter mother of Harvey Oswald were part of what CIA accountant James Wilcott called the, quote, Oswald Project, a highly secret American intelligence operation cryptonymed RX-Zim. The intent of the Oswald Project, RX-Zim, was to send a young man who could read, write, and speak the Russian language to the Soviet Union with a U.S. identity. The American public was never supposed to know anything about Harvey Oswald, or the second Lee Harvey Oswald, or of his caretaker, the Marguerite Oswald imposter. The following sheds light on both the 2 Lee Harvey Oswalds as well as the 2 women who served as their mothers. It dates back to as early as 1947. He has 2 pictures here. I'll describe them. He has a little paragraph. Above left is Marguerite Claverie Oswald, the tall, attractive, well-dressed mother of Lee Harvey Oswald, 1957 photo. Note her horizontal eyebrows, wide smile, and pleasant appearance. On the right is the caretaker of Harvey Oswald, the young man who was accused of assassinating President Kennedy, 1954 photo. This short, heavy-set imposter switched identities with Marguerite Claverie Oswald in 1959 in preparation for Russian-speaking Harvey Oswald's defection to the Soviet Union. She, the imposter, was very short, around 5 foot, had very downward slanting eyebrows, a small mouth, was very heavy set, poorly dressed, and wore glasses. Marguerite Claverie Oswald was born in New Orleans on July 19, 1907. She married Edward Pick in 1929, with whom she had a son, John Pick. Marguerite and Pick divorced. Marguerite soon married Robert Oswald in 1933, with whom she had 2 sons, Robert Oswald, basically Jr., and Lee Harvey Oswald. Marguerite was relatively tall, about 5'6" to 5'7", attractive, well-groomed, always dressed nicely, was continually employed, had straight horizontal eyebrows, a wide smile, and was never known to wear glasses. There's so many pictures here. I'm going to go ahead and put the link to this article in the show notes. So if you're listening to this and you want to look further into it, you can just go check the show notes for the links. On May 7th, 1945, Marguerite Claverie Oswald and Edwin Ekdahl were married in Rockwall, Texas. The photo below on the left shows 5'6" Marguerite and 5'11" to 6 foot tall Ekdahl standing in front of Ekdahl's 1938 Buick on their wedding day. The photo in the middle shows Marguerite and Ekdahl in 1947. The photo on the right is of Marguerite in 1949 standing in front of her 1938 Plymouth at 101 San Saba in Benbrook, Texas. Marguerite Claverie Oswald was a steadying influence on her son Lee Oswald, who always had a history of good attendance in the Fort Worth schools and in New York and New Orleans. In 1947, Marguerite Oswald Ekdahl was living with her husband and son Lee in the upstairs apartment of a duplex at 1505 8th Avenue in Fort Worth. In the summer of 1947, 15-year-old John Pick worked at Walgreens and then at the Tex Gold ice cream parlor 4 blocks south of their apartment. By the end of summer 1947, Pick was promoted to assistant manager. In the fall of 1947, Lee Oswald attended the nearby Lily B. Clayton Elementary School. The Oswalds, Pick, Robert, and Lee, spent the Christmas holidays of 1947 at 1505 8th Avenue with Ekdahl. 1947 was a very important year for the Oswald family. On July 7th, Marguerite Ekdahl purchased a small home at 101 San Saba in Benbrook, Texas, a suburb of Fort Worth. The first tenant at 101 San Saba was the Marguerite Oswald imposter and 7-year-old Harvey Oswald. Georgia Bell, who lived across the street, said that, quote, a short, heavy-set Marguerite Oswald and her young son lived in this house from the summer of 1947 until Thanksgiving. Marguerite Ekdahl, who was then living at 1505 8th Avenue in Fort Worth, owned and rented the house to tenants. The photo on the left shows the tall, nicely dressed Marguerite standing in front of her car, a 1938 Plymouth. The photo on the right shows the same car, a building in the background, and the notation Blackie 1949. The small building was built and owned by Mr. Sells. Both photos were taken at 101 San Saba in Benbrook, a house which Marguerite owned and rented from July 47 to November 6, 1951. In March of 1948, Marguerite Oswald left Edwin Ekdahl, filed for divorce, and moved to a small home at 3300 Willing Street in Fort Worth. On March 9th, Lee Oswald transferred to the nearby George Clark Elementary School in the 2nd grade. John Pick told the Warren Commission, quote, we, Pick and Robert Oswald, returned from Chamberlain Hunt in May 1948 to a house I don't remember the address of, sir, but we were back down in the lower class again. It was right slap next to the railroad tracks. I remember we had to listen to the trains going back and forth. She had moved into this house a couple or 3 months prior to us returning from school. Pick told the Warren Commission, quote, sometime in the summer of 1948, the divorce took place in Tarrant County, city of Fort Worth, June 24th. Right after this is when she purchased a house in Benbrook, the Little House. It was an L-shaped house, sir, being the top was an L was her bedroom, bathroom, kitchen, and the living room with a screened-in porch. She and Lee slept together. My brother and I slept in the living room in the screened-in porch on studio couches. Marguerite Oswald then began working at Leonard's department store, and in late July at the W.C. Stripling Company, Pick told the Warren Commission, quote, my mother informed me that the best thing for me to do was not return to school but to get a job and help the family supplement its income. I obtained a job at Everybody's department store, which belonged to Leonard Brothers. About the same time I went to work and Lee and Robert returned to school is when my mother bought the house at 7408 Ewing, September 1948. From John Pick's testimony, we learned that Marguerite Oswald and her 3 sons lived in the small house at 101 San Saba in July and August of 1948. From July through September of 1949, Marguerite Oswald was assistant store manager of the Lerner's store in Fort Worth. From September 10th to November 24th, 1949, she was working at Bert's shoe store. On November 22nd, she began working in a booth at Cox's department store under the supervision of Mrs. Lowell Hopkins. In January 1950, John Pick joined the U.S. Coast Guard and was assigned to Cape May, New Jersey. In the spring 1950, Marguerite Oswald was fired at Cox's department store and worked briefly for McDonald Kitchens as a hostess. In June, she began working for the Joseph Luker Insurance Agency, National Bankers Life, where she was employed for the next year and a half. Researchers should note that the FBI did a good job in piecing together Marguerite Oswald's work history in the 1940s through the 1950s. Georgia Bell remembered that when her neighbor's house burned down, her neighbor, Mr. Otis Carlton, purchased the property at 101 San Saba. Tarrant County land records showed that on November 6, 1951, Marguerite transferred the title to 101 San Saba to Otis Carlton. 9 days later, on November 15th, Marguerite Oswald purchased a small house at 4833 Birchman, 6 blocks from Stripling Junior High School. On March 6, 1952, Marguerite left the Luker Agency and began working for Evans and Associates. On July 15, 1952, Robert Oswald left home and joined the Marines. 1 month later, on August 20th, Marguerite sold her home at 7408 Ewing. She quit her job, and 2 weeks later, Marguerite Oswald and her 12-year-old son Lee drove their 1948 Dodge to New York City and moved into John Pick and his wife's small apartment in Manhattan. John Pick told the Warren Commission that Lee was enrolled in school close to Pick's apartment. John Pick said this school was between 89th and 90th Streets and between 2nd and 3rd Avenue in Manhattan. A year later, in July-August 1953, Robert Oswald took a 10-day leave from the Marines and drove to New York City. Robert Oswald wrote in his book, Lee, A Portrait of Lee Harvey Oswald by Robert Oswald on page 63, quote, Lee entered the 8th grade at Public School 44 on Columbus Avenue at 76th. This school is the William J. O'Shea Junior High School, identified as PS 44 in Manhattan. New York City has a different public school district for each of the 5 counties that make up the city. Each county corresponds to one of the 5 boroughs: Manhattan, the Bronx, Brooklyn, Staten Island, and Queens. To my surprise, I discovered there was a PS 44 in each of the 5 New York City boroughs. The FBI ignored John Pick's testimony and failed to report records from any school in Manhattan to the Warren Commission. Judge Florence Kelly was the administrative judge of the Family Court of the State of New York in 1963, and the Oswald case file was under her supervision. On November 27, 1963, Judge Kelly allowed SAIC John Malone to review the Oswald file in her chambers and in her presence. She permitted him to take notes of pertinent portions, but would not permit the file to be removed from her office or copied. A few days later, she conferred with the presiding justice of the Appellate Division, Bernard Botine, and with his approval agreed to turn over all original court records in possession of the family court to SAIC Malone. On December 2, 1963, Judge Kelly personally gave the Oswald file to Malone with the condition that it be transmitted immediately to the Warren Commission. Original court records in possession of the family court. 3 days later, on December 5th, 1963, FBI SA Michael O'Rourke advised the Secret Service the file had been sent to the Warren Commission. On December 10th, 8 days after Judge Kelly turned her court file over to the FBI, an internal FBI memo relating to the files of domestic relations court states received by Assistant Director John Malone, 1127 to 12-2. From this memo and Judge Kelly's statement, it is clear Judge Kelly gave the original court file to SAIC Malone. In preparation for the testimony of Marguerite Oswald in February of 1964, the Warren Commission requested Oswald's original New York school and court records from Mayor Wagner of New York City. On February 4th, Miss Bernice McCrae of the mayor's office spoke with Judge Kelly, who advised that she had given the original records to SAIC Malone. Miss McCrae then telephoned the FBI's New York office. She asked if the original records in the Oswald file had in fact been turned over to the Warren Commission. Miss McCrae never received an answer. Later that afternoon, she wrote a letter on behalf of Mayor Wagner to Mr. Rankin of the Warren Commission, which stated, "I'm attaching to this letter copies of the school records. Judge Florence Kelly informed me she turned over all original records in the possession of family court dealing with the case of Lee Harvey Oswald to John Malone, Assistant Director in charge of the New York City office of the FBI. There is no evidence or documentation whatsoever that Malone turned the original court file over to the Warren Commission. On February 7th at 3:37 p.m., FBI Inspector J.R. Malley telephoned the FBI's New York office and spoke to the Assistant Special Agent in charge, William Alexander, about the original court records. Malley advised that FBI headquarters in Washington had no information that indicated the original documents had been received from New York, and he asked Alexander to check further. At 3:45 p.m., Alexander telephoned Malley and advised that SAIC Malone, his supervisor, had photographed the entire file and that copies of the file had been sent to FBI headquarters in Washington. Alexander, however, said there was no record that photographs were sent to FBI headquarters, but that additional photographs of the file were available. Malley then asked that 2 copies of the photographs be sent immediately to his attention at FBI headquarters in Washington. There is no indication that Inspector Malley made any additional inquiries into the fate of the original court files, which were last seen by Judge Kelly when she personally handed them to SAIC Malone. Whenever original records are destroyed and only copies or photographs remain, it is probable that the original documents were altered and then photocopied. The FBI provided the Warren Commission with black and white photographs allegedly of Oswald's New York City school records, which the commission accepted. These photographs showed that Lee Oswald attended Trinity Lutheran School in the Bronx, Public School 117, and Public School 44 in the Bronx. These schools were miles away from schools in Manhattan reported by John Pick and Robert Oswald. In January 1953, the House Un-American Activities Committee file in New York City made reference to a Mrs. M. Oswald in a CIA Office of Security file. This file contained references to 1941, Nazis, and New Jersey. Judge John Tunheim, Tunheim, of the ARRB, wrote to Henry Hyde and requested the HUAC file on Mrs. M. Oswald, but his request was denied. The day after President Kennedy was assassinated, the FBI office in New York City received a telephone call from Mrs. Jack Tippit of Westport, Connecticut. Mrs. Tippit told FBI agent James McCarthy about a phone call she had just received from a woman with a foreign accent. The woman read about the death of DPD Officer Tippit and thought Mrs. Tippit might be a relative. The woman said she was from New York City, would not identify herself, but had come to Westport, Connecticut for the purpose of calling Mrs. Tippit. The woman said she knew Oswald's father and uncle, who were Hungarians and communists. Oswald's father and uncle had lived at 77th and 2nd Avenue in Yorkville, New York City, were unemployed and spent all of their time on communist activities. The woman mentioned the name Weinstock, editor of Woman's World, or perhaps Worker's World, Emil Cardos, and said something about brother-in-law before ending the conversation. Louis Weinstock was head of the Communist Party in New York City and may have been secretly working for the U.S. government. In 1962, Harvey Oswald wrote to The Worker and requested literature and pamphlets. So let me point something out here. I think, is he going to get, I'm not sure if he's going to get to this story coming up. I know we'll get to it at some point, but the story involving Ms. Tippit is someone who identified Harvey Oswald as having been Hungarian, right? Well, we'll see at some point, John Armstrong will point out that the passport that Lee Harvey Oswald had used to get to Moscow it had a notation in it that it was not valid for travel in Hungary. And Armstrong speculated that his handlers feared he might try to flee home to where he was born, which was Hungary. This is speculation, of course, on Armstrong's part. But it's weird how little tiny things like that will connect, right? Hey, it could be a broken clock. You never know. You just never know. All right. In February 1953, John Pick and his family were invited to dinner at the Oswalds' apartment. This was the last time Pick would see his brother for 9 years. In 1962, Pick was invited to Thanksgiving dinner at Robert Oswald's home, where he met the Russian-speaking Harvey Oswald for the first time. Pick told the Warren Commission, quote, "The Lee Harvey Oswald I met in November of 1962 at Thanksgiving was not the Lee Harvey Oswald I had known 10 years previous in New York." When the Warren Commission showed John Pick photographs of Harvey Oswald taken in 1953 at the Bronx Zoo, 1957 in the Marines, and 1963 passing out FPCC literature, he refused to identify these photos as his brother. Robert Oswald most certainly knew that the Russian-speaking Harvey was not his brother because Robert had lived with both Harvey Oswald and the Marguerite Oswald imposter at 4936 Collinwood for 6 months in 1956. On February 17, 1953, Marguerite Claverie Oswald began working at Martin's department store, 501 Fulton Street in the Bronx, listing former employers as Lerner's Shop, New York City, October 1952 to January 1953, Evans and Associates, Fort Worth, January 52 to August of 52, National Bankers Life, Fort Worth, June 50 to January 52. On May 9, 1953, Marguerite began working for Lady Orva Hosiery, 404 Park Avenue South in New York City. She voluntarily terminated employment with Lady Orva on December 26, 1953, because she had already decided to return to New Orleans with her son Lee Oswald. Note, in the spring of 1953, the Marguerite Oswald imposter and Harvey Oswald had appeared before judges in family court. Harvey was remanded to Youth House, interviewed by probation officer John Caro, clinical psychologists, and psychiatrist Dr. Milton Curian. In the summer of 1953, the Marguerite Oswald imposter and Harvey left New York City, traveled through Stanley, North Dakota, and returned to New Orleans, where Harvey was enrolled part-time at Beauregard Junior High School. During the fall of 1953, Marguerite Oswald and Lee Oswald missed a court appearance in New York City and were receiving numerous phone calls from Big Brother, who were requesting to meet in person with Lee Oswald for counseling. And if and when court personnel, counselors, or judges met with Lee Oswald, they would likely realize This young boy was not the same boy arrested and remanded in the youth house. Marguerite Oswald and her son could simply avoid such a confrontation by leaving New York City. In January 1954, Marguerite Claverie Oswald and Lee Oswald relocated from New York to New Orleans, where Lee enrolled in the spring semester of the 8th grade at Beauregard Junior High and was assigned to homeroom 303. Marguerite rented an apartment at 1454 St. Mary's from her longtime close friend Myrtle Evans and began work at Burt's Shoe Store on February 19th. Myrtle Evans and Marguerite had known each other for 20 years. Myrtle saw and talked with Marguerite and Lee Oswald nearly every day when they lived in her apartment building in 1954. Myrtle said Marguerite was a very good housekeeper, very tasty. She was always so lovely herself. She was beautiful. Myrtle's husband, Julian Evans, said of Marguerite, a beautiful woman with black hair streaked with a little gray, but when you saw her on television since this thing happened, she really looked awful. Nothing at all like she used to look. She has really aged. She looked like a charwoman compared to what she used to look like. She used to be a fashion plate. She dressed beautifully, but when we saw her on television just recently after all this happened, she looked awful. There's no other way to describe it. The change that has overcome her. You wouldn't have recognized her if they hadn't told you who she was. She looked that different. Where her hair used to be black is now entirely gray, and she looks really old. She's the same age as my wife, but she looks like she's 70 now. In the late summer of 1953, the Marguerite Oswald imposter and Harvey Oswald left Stanley, North Dakota, and moved to 126 Exchange in New Orleans. Harvey Oswald was enrolled at Beauregard Junior High as a part-time student in the fall semester of 1953. His Beauregard attendance and school records are published in the Warren volumes. A year later, in the fall of 1954, they left New Orleans and moved to 2220 Thomas Place in Fort Worth. Harvey Oswald enrolled in the 9th grade at Stripling Junior High School, which was directly across the street. Marguerite Claverie Oswald and her son Lee then left 1454 St. Mary's and relocated to 126 Exchange. Note, published by the Warren Commission, John Pick Exhibits 22, 23, and 23-8 are letters from Marguerite Oswald to Pick postmarked in New Orleans on May 10th and June 14th, 1954, with the return address Oswald, 1454 St. Mary, New Orleans, Louisiana. Pick Exhibit 24, 24A, 25, and 25A, 26, and 26A are letters from Marguerite Oswald to Pick postmarked in New Orleans on October 14th, November 12th, and November 11th, with the return address of 126 Exchange Place. Marguerite Oswald continued to work at Burt's Shoe Store until she was discharged on October 9th. A month later, on November 15th, she began working at Chandler's Shoe Store. In the fall of 1954, Lee Oswald became friends with Ed Vobel, who often visited their apartment at 126 Exchange and met Lee Oswald's mother, Marguerite Oswald. Following the assassination, Vobel saw Mrs. Oswald, the imposter, on television and photographs of her in the newspapers. Vobel told the Warren Commission, I had a picture in my mind which was different from when I saw her in the paper after all of this happened. I didn't recognize her. She was a lot thinner, and her hair wasn't as gray as I recall when I met her. The woman Vobel met in 1955, the tall, nice-looking Marguerite Claverie Oswald, was not the woman he saw in the newspapers and on television, the short, heavy-set Marguerite Oswald imposter. 7 months later, in June 1955, Lee Oswald and Ed Vobel attended a Civil Air Patrol meeting at Moisant Airport. 15-year-old Lee soon got a full-time job at the Gerald F. Toujague Company, a local freight forwarder. Lee Oswald's supervisor, Frank DiBenedetto, told the House Select Committee on Assassinations that Oswald worked for the Toujagues for a year to a year and a half, from June 1955 through the summer of 1956. This was a serious problem, which the HSCA ignored. In the fall of 1955, while Lee Harvey Oswald was working for Frank DiBenedetto at Toujagues, another Lee Harvey Oswald was attending Warren Easton High School. The FBI managed to solve this problem by manipulating Lee Oswald's employment records. The day after the assassination, the FBI collected all of Lee Oswald's weekly time cards from Toujagues. However, they used only a small number of those cards for the purpose of limiting the time he worked at Toujagues. The FBI told the Warren Commission in the fall of 1955 Oswald attended 6 weeks of school at Warren Easton High School. This means that Oswald's time cards from Toujagues from June 1955 through early October 1955 had to be destroyed. The FBI was then able to say that Oswald quit school in early October and began working at Toujagues through early January 1956. After quitting Tujague's, Oswald worked for Nick Mazza at J.R. Michaels' company for 1 week in mid-January. The FBI then told the Warren Commission, with no evidence whatsoever, that Oswald worked a few weeks at the Pfister Dental Lab in New Orleans. The FBI then created fake W-2 forms for 1955 and 1956, Tujague's, J.R. Michaels, and Pfister Dental Lab, to bolster their claim of Oswald's employment at age 15 in New Orleans. The FBI's manipulation and fabrication of evidence was essential in covering up the existence of 2 Lee Harvey Oswalds in 1955 through 1956. On January 7, 1956, Marguerite Oswald's employment at Chandler's shoe store ended. According to neighbor Mildred Sawyer, Marguerite then found work at Krieger's and later at Goldring's department store on March 16th. It's worth noting that the FBI never obtained employment records for Marguerite Oswald from either Goldring's or Krieger's in New Orleans. Why? Because her employment at Goldring's in 1956 conflicted with the Marguerite Oswald imposter living in Fort Worth at the same time. Her employment in New Orleans from 59 through 61 conflicted with the Marguerite Oswald imposter living and working in Fort Worth. After 4.5 months at Goldring's department store, Marguerite Claverie Oswald voluntarily terminated her employment on July 31st, 1956. Lee Oswald quit his job at Tujague's and told his boss, Frank DiBenedetto, he was going to join the Marines. John Pick told the Warren Commission that Robert Oswald drove to New Orleans, picked up his mother, Marguerite Oswald, and brother Lee, and then drove them to Fort Worth. Marguerite rented an apartment at 3830 West 6th in September and resided in this apartment for the next 2 years. At the same time, Robert Oswald was living 1.8 miles away at 4936 Collinwood with the Marguerite Oswald imposter and Harvey Oswald. So that's something I find fascinating, is that Robert Oswald was living with both of these people at different times. Right? He knew both of these. He had his real brother and his real mother, and then he had his fake brother and his fake mother, and he was an obvious go-between. I mean, he was in the Marines first. Did he get picked up by intelligence first? I mean, he had to have been on this. He had to have been in on it since the beginning. I mean, there couldn't have been later at all. It had to have been much earlier, before he even went to the Marines. I mean, their whole military life must have been pre-planned and staged. Note, on February 21st, 1961, the Fort Worth Retail Merchants Association, at the request of FBI agent John Fain, provided information from their files on Marguerite Oswald. On May 29th, 57, she was residing at 3830 West 6th with previous address listed at 7408 Ewing. That's 1948 to 1952. 3300 Willing, summer 1948, and 1505 8th Avenue, 1947 and summer 1948. This is an accurate and complete list of Marguerite Oswald's addresses in Fort Worth from 47 through 59. However, not a single one of these addresses were for the Marguerite Oswald imposter. The short, heavy-set imposter lived at 101 San Saba, 4936 Collinwood, 1031 West 5th, 3124 West 5th, 2220 Thomas Place, 313 Templeton Drive, 3613 Harley, 1410 Hurley Street, 1407 8th Avenue, 1501 West 7th in Waco, Texas, Boyd, Texas, and Vernon, Texas. In other words, while residing at more than a dozen different addresses in and around Fort Worth, the Marguerite Oswald imposter avoided contact with any business that would request credit on a Marguerite Oswald. This imposter did not apply for employment at a medium or large business in Fort Worth. She did not open a bank account in Fort Worth. She had no utility services in her name: water, sewer, electric, gas, telephone, or garbage. She had no homeowners or auto insurance, and she never applied for credit. The Marguerite Oswald imposter avoided any and all contact with businesses that would cause her name to be reported to the Fort Worth Retail Merchants Association or any other credit bureau. Note 2, the same report from the Fort Worth Retail Merchants Association shows their file on Marguerite Oswald was opened in April 1936. But in April 1936, Marguerite Oswald was married and living in New Orleans, Louisiana. Her first known visit to Fort Worth was 10 years later in 1946 with Edwin Ekdahl. So how and why was the Fort Worth Retail Merchants Association able to open a credit file on Marguerite Oswald in April of 1936? In October of 1956, Lee Oswald joined the Marines and visited his mother at 3830 West 6th, apartment number 3, when on leave. Marguerite's neighbor, Mr. Lee McCracken, told the FBI that Lee Oswald resided with his mother on 1 or 2 occasions when on leave from the Marines and stayed around the home for about 2 weeks on each trip. There are no known FBI reports of an interview with the landlord which would have shown that Marguerite Oswald lived in apartment 3 from late August 1956 through the spring of 1959. Such information would have conflicted with numerous FBI interviews that placed a second Marguerite Oswald at more than 11 different locations during the same time period. Mr. McCracken told the FBI that Marguerite Oswald worked at the Clyde Campbell's men's store in downtown Fort Worth. His memory was supported by the Fort Worth Retail Merchants Association, whose records show that Marguerite Oswald was working for Clyde Campbell's men's store in March, April, and May of 1957 and living at 3830 West 6th in apartment number 3. On May 29, 1957, the tall Marguerite Clavery Oswald, residing at 3830 West 6th, applied for employment at Leonard's department store. The Retail Merchants Credit Association, at the request of Leonard's, reported the following information. Marguerite Oswald was living in apartment 3 at 3830 West 6th in Fort Worth, where she had been living for the past year since August of 56. Marguerite had been employed at Clyde Campbell's men's store for the past 2 months, April and May of 1957, and previous addresses were listed as 7408 Ewing, 2300 Willing, and 1505 8th Avenue. On May 1st, 1957, the Marguerite Oswald imposter left 4936 Collinwood, moved to 1031 West 5th, but still owed her landlady for unpaid utility bills. On 3 separate occasions, Mrs. James Taylor, landlady at 4936 Collinwood, drove to 1031 West 5th and confronted the Marguerite Oswald imposter about unpaid utility bills. Marguerite, however, refused to pay the utility bills. It is worth noting that from 1947 through early 1962, there's no indication that the Marguerite Oswald imposter owned a car or knew how to drive. How she was able to travel and pay expenses to move from Fort Worth to New York to Stanley, North Dakota, to New Orleans, to Fort Worth, to California, to New Orleans, and back to Fort Worth remains unknown. How she was able to move from one address to another in New Orleans, several addresses, Fort Worth over a dozen, and a small town, several addresses in North Texas, remains unknown. In the fall of 1957, the unemployed Marguerite Oswald imposter left Fort Worth, traveled to New Orleans, and moved into the Hotel Senator. How this unemployed woman was able to afford a relatively expensive hotel month after month remains unknown. After leaving Clyde Campbell's men's store, Marguerite Clavery Oswald obtained employment at Paul's Shoe Store. There's a photo here, at 606 Houston in Fort Worth. During 1957 and 1958, Marguerite was also a sales representative. John Pick told the Warren Commission that his mother, Marguerite Oswald, traveled to New York and stayed over the Christmas holidays, left approximately the 10th of January, sometime in 1958. Pick and his family were living on Long Island, New York, but there was no indication of how his mother traveled from Fort Worth to Long Island. While Marguerite Oswald was visiting John Pick and his family in New York, the Marguerite Oswald imposter and Harvey Oswald were living at Hotel Senator in New Orleans, and young Harvey was working across the street at the Pfister Dental Laboratory. In the spring of 1958, Marguerite Oswald left Paul's Shoe Store and began working for Family Publications. The 1958 Fort Worth City Directory listed her address as 3830 West 6th. In late spring 1958, the Marguerite Oswald imposter and Harvey Oswald moved from the Hotel Senator in New Orleans to 3006 Bristol Road in Fort Worth. The Marguerite Oswald imposter would live at this address until February of 1959. Note Lee Harvey Oswald's 1958 income tax return, which is nearly illegible except for the signature and date of February 16, 59, listed his address as 3006 Bristol Road. In September 1958, Harvey Oswald returned to the Marine Corps and was briefly in Taiwan and Japan. At the same time, medical records show that Lee Oswald was in Atsugi and visited the base hospital on several occasions. In late October 1958, while Lee Oswald was still in Japan, Harvey Oswald arrived at MACS 9 in Santa Ana. Lee Oswald departed Japan on November 3, 1958, en route to San Francisco. In the fall of 1958, Marguerite Oswald began working for Cox's department store, 7th and Throckmorton in Fort Worth. John Pick, while driving across the country with his family, visited his mother at Cox's department store and then spent the night at her home on Halloween night, 1958. Robert Oswald, who was then working for Borden's Milk, visited his mother, John Pick, and his family, and then left some milk for his mother before leaving. Pick and his family then drove to Robert's house, 7313 Davenport, where they stayed for 2 days and then continued driving to California. The Marguerite Oswald imposter, who was then living at 3006 Bristol Road in Fort Worth, was working for King Candy Company in a booth at a Fair Ridgely, a department store in Fort Worth on December 5, 1958. She allegedly suffered an injury when a large jar fell from a shelf onto her head. During the next year, the Marguerite Oswald imposter was unemployed and visited numerous physicians about her alleged head injury in an attempt to receive workers' compensation insurance. During one of her visits, she told Dr. Goldberg that her son wanted to defect to Russia. During the month of February 1959, the unemployed Marguerite Oswald imposter moved from 3006 Bristol Road to a duplex at 313 Templeton Drive in Fort Worth, less than a block east, where her neighbor was Melba Childs. On April 20th, 1959, the Marguerite Oswald imposter filed a notice of claim for compensation with the Industrial Accident Board of Texas. She listed her address as 313 Templeton Drive, Fort Worth, and identified the person who witnessed her signature as Mrs. Melba Childs, her neighbor at 313 Templeton Drive. While the unemployed Marguerite Oswald imposter was living at 313 Templeton Drive in April of 1959, Robert Oswald told the Warrant Commission that in April of 59 he visited his mother at Cox's department store in Fort Worth. Marguerite Claverie Oswald had previously worked at Cox's in the early 1950s under the supervision of Mrs. Lowell Hopkins. In 1963, the FBI interviewed Mrs. Hopkins, who said after seeing Mrs. Oswald picture in the newspaper and on television, she could not say that she recognized the picture as being Mrs. Oswald because, in her opinion, there's been a great deal of change in her physical appearance. From 1963 onward, the only photos that appeared in newspapers and television were of those of the Marguerite Oswald imposter. In June of 1959, the Marguerite Oswald imposter moved into a small two-room apartment at the rear of 3124 West 5th in Fort Worth. On July 28th, 7 months after her alleged injury, the Marguerite Oswald imposter went to the Red Cross office and signed an affidavit listing her monthly expenditures at $230.75. She was unable to work, had no prospects of any income, and requested that her son be discharged from the Marines so that he could return home and provide for her. On August 7, 1959, the Marguerite Oswald imposter again stopped by the Red Cross office to prepare the Class Q allotment forms, discuss her financial condition, and sign a parent dependency affidavit which had been mailed to her on July 31st. She gave the name of her son as Harvey Lee Oswald. One of the questions on the allotment form asked the birth date of Marguerite Oswald's deceased husband, Robert Edward Lee Oswald. The short, dumpy, heavy-set Marguerite imposter, who was never married to Robert Lee Oswald, wrote, "Not known." On September 11th, 1959, Lee Harvey Oswald received a hardship discharge from active service, claiming his mother, the Marguerite Oswald imposter, needed care. He listed his address as 3124 West 5th in Fort Worth. Harvey Oswald supposedly returned to Fort Worth, spent a few days with the Marguerite Oswald imposter, and then went to New Orleans. In October, the unemployed Marguerite Oswald imposter moved to a small apartment at 1013 West 5th. And on October 31st, 1959, when the article first appeared in Fort Worth newspapers about Oswald's defection, she gave her address as 3616 Harley, a non-existent address. In early 1960, after Oswald's defection, the Marguerite Oswald imposter relocated to 1605 8th Avenue in Fort Worth. News reporter Les Struther interviewed that Marguerite Oswald imposter and reported, quote, "Marguerite was injured in December of 1958 on the job when a carton of candy struck her in the face. She hasn't been able to work since. Unemployed for more than 1 year, yet somehow this Marguerite Oswald imposter has enough money to frequently change addresses, money for rent, food, transportation, and utilities." In early 1960, the IRS mailed a 1040A short form for the 1959 tax year to Lee Harvey Oswald at 3006 Bristol Road from the address listed on Oswald's 1958 return. The form was apparently forwarded to the Marguerite Oswald imposter and arrived at 1605 8th Avenue. On March 22, 1960, the Marguerite Oswald imposter allegedly filled out, signed, and mailed Oswald's 1959 1040A short form and gave Oswald's addresses as 1605 8th Avenue, Fort Worth, Texas. In April 1960, while allegedly working and or residing at 1111 Herring Avenue in Waco, Texas, the Marguerite Oswald imposter wrote a letter to the Marine Corps and gave her address as 1410 Hurley in Fort Worth, which was the address of Velma Marlin, who worked for the Fort Worth Star-Telegram newspaper. Marlin was accepting phone calls and mail for the Marguerite Oswald imposter and then forwarding her mail at 1111 Herring Avenue in Waco, Texas. On July 1st, 1960, the Marguerite Oswald imposter returned to Fort Worth and rented a small apartment from Herman Manthe at 1407 8th Avenue. On September 1st, 1960, the short, dumpy, heavy-set Marguerite Oswald imposter moved from 1407 8th Avenue in Fort Worth to Boyd, Texas, a small community 35 miles northwest of Fort Worth. In the summer of 1959, Marguerite Oswald was still working for Cox's department store in Fort Worth. As of June 27, 1960, Marguerite Oswald was also working as a sales lady for Avon Products. Fellow co-worker Gene Watson remembered that Mrs. Oswald sold Avon products to his wife while working with her at Paul's Shoe Store in 1957 and 1958. On October 14, 1960, Marguerite Oswald closed her account at the First National Bank in Fort Worth. This is the last known date of Marguerite Claverie Oswald in Fort Worth before she moved to New Orleans. Following the assassination of President Kennedy, the FBI interviewed two women who had known Marguerite Oswald for many years and saw her working in New Orleans. Mrs. Logan Magruder and Mrs. Oris Duane told the FBI they met and talked with Marguerite in New Orleans in 1960. Mrs. Logan Magruder, who had known Marguerite since 1943, saw and chatted with her while she, Marguerite, was working at Krieger's department store. Mrs. Oris Duane and Marguerite's supervisor at Jean's hosiery shop in New Orleans in 1940s. Marguerite stopped by Lady Oris Hosiery, where Mrs. Duane was the store manager. Marguerite told Mrs. Duane that she was working at Goldring's department store selling dresses. In September of 1960, while Marguerite Oswald was living and working in New Orleans, the Marguerite Oswald imposter was living in Boyd, Texas, 30 miles northwest of downtown Fort Worth. The FBI now had reports that placed Marguerite Oswald working at Goldring's and Krieger's department store in 1960. At the same time, the FBI had reports that the Marguerite Oswald imposter was living in Boyd, Texas. The FBI intentionally failed to secure employment records from Goldring's and Krieger's department stores and failed to interview management and coworkers. They failed to obtain canceled payroll checks from Goldring's and Krieger's, as well as federal and state income tax records for Mrs. Oswald from the state of Louisiana and the IRS. The FBI clearly had failed to conduct an honest investigation concerning Marguerite Oswald's employment in Fort Worth, New Orleans from 1956 through 1961. Because those records would have conflicted with the Marguerite Oswald imposter's various residences and employment in New Orleans and Texas at the time. FBI agents thoroughly investigated Marguerite Oswald's employment from the early 1940s through the mid-1950s. They interviewed employers, coworkers, and determined beginnings and end dates of her employment. But in 1956, their investigation of Marguerite Oswald and her employment ended because their investigation was now focused entirely on the Marguerite Oswald imposter, the alleged mother of the man accused of killing the president. All right, so let me see, how far did we get it? We're not even quite halfway on this thing yet, so we're going to pick up here on Monday morning, and that's going to do it for me, guys.